Thunder roars across the sky as a savage storm gathers on the horizon. Massive trees sway under the impact of the biting winds, and heavy raindrops explode against the ground, forming puddles of mud. The camera pans across the desolate valley, revealing a brutal scene. In the center, a giant T-Rex stands over the carcass of a freshly slaughtered ceratopsian. The beast's razor-sharp teeth are stained with fresh blood, and chunks of flesh still drip from its jaws. The ground is soaked. Mud mixes with the blood of its prey, creating a grotesque and grim spectacle. The T-Rex's every move seems calculated and relentless, as it tears apart its prey with absurd ease. But something is wrong. The T-Rex jerks its head up, its eyes scanning the horizon with a rare uneasiness. Even at the height of its strength, something makes it tense. Its nostrils flare, inhaling the humid air in search of a specific scent. Nervous movements, heavy footsteps that resound like thunder. He is not hunting. He is fleeing from an invisible enemy. Further on, in the shelter of a cliff, a cub hides among roots and rocks. Its curious, innocent eyes watch the adult expectantly. Rain drips down its scaly skin as it cowers, trying to understand what is happening. The adult T-Rex turns his gaze to the cub for a moment. Something about the way he looks at the little one is unusual, a mix of protectiveness and desperation, as if every fiber of his body tells him that this storm is not the real threat. A sharp cut to fossils partially buried in the mud, bones broken and deformed by something that was no ordinary attack, fragments corroded and strangely altered. The world believes that the T-Rex was an absolute king, but even the most powerful monster is not immune to terror. Something stalks him, silent and relentless. Something that will force him to make the most terrible decision of all. The dense forest seemed to breathe, with each leaf trembling under the force of the incessant rain. Everything was wet, slippery, and the air carried a strong smell of rot mixed with mud. The T-Rex advanced slowly along the sodden trail, its muscles tense under its thick, scaly skin. Each step crushed branches and bushes with a wet crack. But its eyes, alert and frantic, were not focused on the trail ahead. They were searching for something they could not see, something that pursued it invisibly and relentlessly. It was the smell, that strange, sickly stench that hung in the air like an invisible poison. It was not the common smell of death or hunting. It was different, deeper, as if the earth itself was sick. It sniffed the air aggressively, searching for a concrete source for the discomfort, but there was nothing. No predator hiding in shadows, no smaller creature trying to take advantage of its remains. Only that putrid aroma that insisted on haunting it. A few meters behind, the cub followed with difficulty, stumbling in the mud and letting out small grunts of discomfort. The rain made the little one's skin slimy and shiny, making him even more vulnerable. He was too young to understand the danger, but the adult knew. He had seen it before. Other cubs, members of his own species, rotting alive inside, wounds that never healed, as if the flesh refused to regenerate. Cloudy eyes, fragile and staggering bodies, unable to keep up with the relentless pace of the adults. No matter how much he attacked his usual enemies, there was nothing he could tear or crush to get rid of this threat. It was an invisible enemy, a disease, a plague that spread like wildfire, destroying everything it touched. And worst of all, it seemed to prefer the cubs. The adult T-Rex watched the little one with growing concern. Every muffled cough, every stumble, and every irregular breath were signs that the thing he feared most had already set in. The cub was infected. Now, that uncomfortable feeling of protection that the T-Rex felt was mixed with something much more cruel: despair. He could crush bones, tear flesh, and face the biggest rivals in his territory. But this was different. This was a predator he could not attack. The only thing left was to decide what to do with the little one before it was too late. The storm was finally showing signs of weakening, but the world around him remained implacable. Dark puddles of mud accumulated between the broken trees, and the smell of rot lingered like a curse stuck to the earth. The T-Rex advanced with the stumbling cub right behind. The little one's every step felt like a fight against his own body, his muscles weak and his breathing heavy. The adult stopped frequently, watching the cub with a look that humans would call concern, but for him was pure survival strategy. The Cretaceous was a deadly, non-stop game, and none of that made life any easier for a predator that needed to carry extra weight. It was then that he felt it. There was no noise, no sudden movements, just a presence, a latent, calculating threat watching from somewhere among the twisting trees. Another predator. The T-Rex's powerful jaws contracted, its teeth serrated like blades ready to destroy anything that came near. It turned slowly, staring into the silence with wide, pulsing eyes. The heavy air carried the scent of something else. Flesh, blood, but it wasn't his. Sudden, aggressive movements appeared to his left. The vegetation exploded in a whirlwind of leaves and mud as another predator charged at him. It was a group of dromaeosaurids, agile and thirsty, smaller and more fragile than the T-Rex, but with claws sharp enough to rip through flesh like it was paper. They moved in sync, surrounding him with a precision that was anything but accidental. A direct attack would be suicide. But that wasn't what they wanted. The real target was a few meters behind. The cub. The small, weak, and disoriented one tried to retreat with clumsy steps, its feet sinking into the mud as it let out short, desperate squeaks. The T-Rex advanced violently, throwing its body weight against the group of smaller predators, jaws closing and opening, teeth sinking into the flesh of one of the attackers and tearing him apart in a single, brutal movement. But the others didn't retreat. On the contrary, they seemed to be incited by the smell of blood. The attack became increasingly aggressive, increasingly calculated. They didn't want to face the adult T-Rex. They wanted to tire it out, distract it long enough to reach the cub. One more advance, and another dromaeosaurid fell. Torn screams of pain echoed through the forest. The survivors finally gave up, disappearing into the shadows like ghosts. But the relief was short-lived. The cub, now covered in mud and scratches, could barely move. It was breathing with difficulty, letting out a hoarse sound that sounded more like a muffled moan. The disease was winning, and the attack of the predators had made everything worse. It was obvious that the cub would not survive much longer. Each movement seemed to cost energy that it did not have. The T-Rex approached, observing that small, weakened body. Silence settled again, as a warning that the worst was yet to come. He knew that the attacks would not stop. The rivals would always return, hungry and opportunistic. And carrying that extra weight was like walking with a target on your back. But abandoning it was not an option, at least not yet. The sun was beginning to rise timidly on the horizon, dyeing the sky a sickly orange hue. The storm had dissipated, but the ground was still saturated with mud and crushed leaves. The humid, dense air made every breath a constant effort. The calf trailed behind the adult, but its steps were becoming shorter, uncoordinated, and hesitant. It seemed to stumble over its own legs, as if the ground beneath its feet were unstable and treacherous. The T-Rex stopped every few feet, casting quick, calculated glances at the little one. The illness was obvious now. The calf's skin was pale, its eyes half-lidded and cloudy. Its breath came in irregular gasps, as if there wasn't enough air. To any other predator prowling around, this was an irresistible invitation, a sure sign of fragility, an easy target. And Cretaceous predators knew the scent of weakness. The adult knew this. Every sound, every movement in the shadows felt like a potential threat. There was no rest. There was no safe haven. The young were the weakest link, the blind spot that no T-Rex could fully protect. An adult could defend itself with teeth and claws, but a young? It depended on constant protection, and even that was rarely enough. The memory of young that had succumbed before it still weighed like invisible scars on the T-Rex's mind, a strange smell, an infection that spread without warning. Small bodies that stopped moving in the middle of the night. It was not uncommon for young to die before they even reached considerable size. Some fell at the claws of opportunistic predators. Others succumbed to unknown diseases that spread like wildfire across a dry prairie. But worst of all was cannibalism. Abandoned young, too weak to follow the group, often became prey to the adults themselves, a brutal measure of survival. And even worse, it was often the parent who did the deed. What if that young couldn't make it? Had the weight of the disease been too much? The questions echoed in the adult's mind like a silent scream. With each step, the cub fell behind. His weakened body could barely keep up. The forest around him was still alive with sounds and movements. Small predators lurked, waiting for a mistake, for a moment of carelessness. The T-Rex advanced, forcing the cub to follow him, but with every meter covered, the fatigue seemed to multiply. The little one's trembling legs sank into the mud, his eyes blinking slowly, as if sleep were stronger than his own survival instinct. The adult stopped again, staring at the small, panting body. Every second lost, there was a greater risk, a delay that could attract the right predators. But leaving him behind was not an option, not yet. However, the cruel choice that was approaching was as inevitable as the dawn of the next day. The silence of the forest was broken only by the low, intermittent moans of the cub. Every sound he made seemed like a muffled cry of despair, echoing through the empty valley and attracting unwanted curiosity. The adult observed the little one's every movement with an intensity that went beyond simple concern. It was not affection, it was calculation, a pure and cold analysis of what this meant for their own survival. The cub was worse. His legs, which had previously been merely trembling, now buckled frequently, as if his bones could no longer support the weight of his weakened body. His breathing was irregular and desperate, and his dull gaze indicated a fatigue that went beyond the physical. It was as if the very will to continue had begun to disappear. But the real problem was not the cub's condition. It was what this meant for the adult. The Cretaceous was not a place for weakness. Smaller predators, opportunists, and parasites were always lurking, waiting for any sign of vulnerability. The smell of disease was like a bright beacon to those who hunted in the shadows, and the cub was emitting this signal at maximum volume. The adult knew it. Every second they remained still, there was another chance for predators to approach. And with every step they took, the calf fell further behind, its small, fragile body dragging through the mud like dead weight. It was a threat, a growing risk that put not only its own life in danger, but that of anyone who tried to protect it. The concept of protection among dinosaurs was never simple. It was brutal, based purely on utility and the cost of keeping something alive. A healthy calf was an investment in the future, but a sick calf? It was an invitation to death. Some modern predators sacrifice their own young in extreme situations. Lions kill entire litters to ensure that only the strongest survive. Bears devour their own young when resources become scarce. And even among smaller animals, infanticide is a common practice when conditions are not favorable to survival. And what about the T-Rex? In a world where death lurked at every turn, cruelty was just another method of survival. The adult stopped again, watching the cub lying in the mud, gasping as if air were a scarce resource. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the entire environment seemed to stop. There, before him, was a dilemma that no amount of brute force could resolve, a conflict between the instinct to protect and the instinct to survive. The only thing worse than abandoning the cub would be to risk one's own life for it. But what do you do when the enemy is not something that can be attacked or destroyed? When the real enemy is the sick blood that runs through the little one's veins? The decision had to be made, but for now, the T-Rex remained there, still, hesitant, as if the act of simply moving forward was the hardest thing he had ever done. The gray sky stretched like a morbid veil over the forest. The trees, still soaked from the recent storm, dripped water as if the world itself were crying. But what caused the real terror did not come from the sky, nor from the predatory shadows that moved among the twisted branches. It was something smaller, invisible. The T-Rex moved forward, dragging its own weight with silent aggression. With each step, the calf fell behind, slower and slower, more and more fragile. The adult did not need to turn around to notice the decline. The sound of the calf's breathing was enough. It was a harsh, irregular sound, as if air refused to enter its lungs. The calf coughed, a hoarse, wet noise that sounded like an unpleasant crack. Dark liquid ran from its nostrils, dripping into the mud and mixing with the sodden ground. Something was rotting inside. In the last few days, the calf had deteriorated at an alarming rate. Its movements were slower, its eyes increasingly opaque. Even when he tried to feed, he rejected the food with desperate, trembling movements. It was as if his body was giving up the fight. The adult watched with a coldness that was mixed with growing impatience. Whatever was killing the cub, zrение сделал это медленно и жестоко. The smell of infection was everywhere, a pungent, putrid odor that could not be ignored. In that hostile environment, even the slightest sign of illness was an invitation to death. And the cub was announcing its weakness with every agonizing breath. There were stories of other creatures that had succumbed to the same plague, bones found with strange marks, as if the flesh had disintegrated from the inside out. Deformed skulls, corroded ribs, and vertebrae fused together by some kind of brutal disease. The plague that circulated through the valley did not choose its victims. It could attack herbivores and carnivores alike. But among the T-Rex, the cubs were the most vulnerable. Their young bodies did not have the strength to fight the invisible invader that consumed them from within. The adult approached the cub, which was now practically motionless. Only the slight contraction of its chest indicated that it was still alive. His eyes, dull and dull, could barely focus. He tried to stand up when the adult approached, but his legs gave out and his body collapsed into the mud, letting out a muffled, pathetic grunt. The adult remained there, motionless. The only thing that moved were his eyes, assessing, judging. This was not just weakness, it was a warning, a death sentence that dragged on with the cruelty of something inevitable. In the brutal nature of the Cretaceous, mercy did not exist, and disease, silent and persistent, was the cruelest weapon of all. As the cub agonized in the mud, the adult took a few steps back, as if the simple act of keeping his distance would be enough to stop the plague from spreading. But the smell was still there, sticky and unbearable. Death was already there, and he knew it. The only question that remained was how long it would take for it to complete its work. The forest seemed plunged into a suffocating silence. Not even the wind dared to pierce the twisted trees that surrounded the valley. It was as if the world itself held its breath, waiting for the inevitable. The adult T-Rex stood still, watching the calf that lay in the mud a few meters behind. Small spasms ran through the creature's weakened body, as if even the simple act of breathing was torture. The disease had consumed almost everything. The little one was now just a twisted shadow of the life he had once possessed. His eyes, once lively and curious, were dull, like embers that had long since been extinguished. The acrid smell of infection enveloped the air like a toxic cloud, making it impossible to ignore the fact that there was no turning back. There was no recovery. There was no salvation, and the adult knew it. His heavy footsteps advanced slowly towards the calf, each movement echoing like a baleful drum in the sodden mud. There was no hesitation. There was no mercy. Only a cold, brutal acceptance of reality. The survival of a predator like the T-Rex allowed no room for sentimentality. Keeping that sick cub around was an immense risk. Not only did it attract the smaller predators that roamed the territory, but it also weakened the adult itself, which had to divert energy and attention to protect a being that was already doomed. The fossils found by paleontologists millions of years later would tell the story of a brutal attack. Deep wounds in young bones, teeth marks that should never have been left by an adult of the same species. Some scientists believed that these marks were the result of a desperate fight against a smaller predator. Others suggested that the cub had been abandoned and attacked later. But there was a darker hypothesis, a deliberate sacrifice, a cruel but practical decision. The adult T-Rex positioned itself above the cub, its eyes fixed on the creature that was still breathing with difficulty. A muffled sound escaped the little one's throat, a last plea, empty of any hope. The adult slowly opened its jaws, its teeth stained with ancient blood shining in the pale light that filtered through the leaves. The next movement was quick, final. The sound of bones breaking echoed through the forest like thunder. The calf's body stopped moving instantly, its suffering finally interrupted by an act of swift and precise violence. The adult's head remained lowered for a long moment, its teeth still embedded in the inert flesh. Perhaps it was a gesture of mourning. Perhaps it was just an instinctive calculation of efficiency. In the end, it didn't matter. The calf had become a risk, And now the risk had been eliminated. The T-Rex walked away from the body without looking back, its steady, merciless footsteps echoing through the valley once again. For it was over. The threat had been eradicated. But millions of years later, the scientists who would find those bones would come across a story they could never have imagined. And the question that would remain in the air would not only be about survival, but about what exactly was capable of turning the greatest predator on Earth into a murderer of his own children. The body of the abandoned cub was left behind, sinking into the mud like a dead weight that the world had decided to swallow. The forest continued its indifferent course. The sounds of the small predators, previously driven away by fear of the adult, began to approach again. It would not be long before the corpse was discovered by smaller creatures, opportunists who feasted on a weakness of others. The Cretaceous never gave a break. The adult T-Rex advanced through the valley with a renewed purpose. The burden he had carried for so long was gone, torn away with a brutality that only he could have imposed. But the decision did not mean relief, only a greater chance of staying alive. He advanced between the trees with a veracity that only desperation could feed. His eyes scanned the environment with an urgency that bordered on frenzy. Without the cub to protect, each step was faster, more brutal, but the world around him continued to change. The territory he knew was changing. It was as if the forests themselves were shrinking, and the rivers that had once been abundant were becoming increasingly scarce. A silent drought was spreading across entire regions, leaving a trail of death and decay. And where the water disappeared, conflicts intensified. Other predators were emerging more frequently, rivals who, like him, fought for whatever food source remained. Constant, bloody battles that often ended with mutilated bodies left to rot under the cruel sun. The T-Rex's own species was becoming a target. It was as if the brutality of the environment was accelerating an inevitable process. Each loss, each confrontation left the clan weaker. As he hunted and fought for his territory, he often came across bones, the remains of other T-Rex, abandoned in desolate valleys or near dry waterways. Cracked skulls, broken ribs, and teeth marks that indicated battles as desperate as they were futile. The T-Rex advanced on the carcass of a decomposing ceratopsian, its teeth tearing at the hardened flesh with an aggression that bordered on desperation. It devoured what it could without caring about the acrid smell of rot that permeated the air. This was no longer a question of dominating territory. It was a constant fight against time. The disease that had destroyed the calf was not an isolated case. Other young T-Rex showed signs of weakness, infections that consumed the body and left visible marks on the bones. The number of healthy calves was dwindling, and each loss was a mortal blow to the survival of the species. For the adult, the concept of legacy was instinctive, something imprinted in its nature, but ensuring the species continued to exist was becoming increasingly difficult. Every year, the environment became less hospitable. Prey became scarce. Rivals multiplied. Diseases spread like an invisible fire that no one could put out. That land was no longer a kingdom. It was a battlefield where only the strongest or the most ruthless could survive. The T-Rex continued its journey, a lonely ghost in a world that was slowly dying. Each step was a challenge imposed by nature itself, as if the planet were deciding who deserved to continue existing and who should disappear. The last legacy of the T-Rex would not be one of power or glory. It would be one of struggle, pure and desperate struggle. And the adult knew that no matter how much he continued to advance, that world only offered him two options: resist or become just another body rotting in the mud. The valley had become a silent cemetery. Dead trees raised their twisted branches like exposed bones, and the dry mud cracked under the weight of each step of the T-Rex. There wasn't much left to hunt. Most of the prey had migrated far away, looking for water and food in territories that might no longer exist. The few herbivores that remained were frail, sick, as hungry as the predators that hunted them. The T-Rex advanced through a territory that was once teeming with life. Now all it found were abandoned carcasses and empty trails. Its jaws clamped down on nothing, its tense, hungry muscles contracted in spasms of frustration. But hunger wasn't the only problem. The disease, the same plague that had devoured the cub, continued to spread. Other young T-Rexes succumbed in the same way. Fragile, deformed bones, flesh that rotted even before death arrived. The adult watched the young ones that still managed to stand. Each of them fought against an invisible enemy, their heavy breathing and clumsy movements revealing that the plague was everywhere. And he knew that, for those puppies, fate was already sealed. There was no time for hesitation. There was no room for mercy. The only way to protect what was left of the pride was to stop the spread of the disease before it destroyed them all. The first cub fell 2 days later, a small, bony creature, crawling through the mud while its half-closed eyes stared at the adult with a plea for help that would never come. When the T-Rex's teeth closed over the little one's body, the sound was muffled but definitive, a dry crack that echoed through the valley like a warning. But the adult did not stop. He could not stop. Other cubs showed the same signs of weakness, small groups that moved like sick shadows, each one marked by the infection that destroyed their bodies from within. And one by one, the T-Rex eliminated them. With each blow, with each brutal bite, the plague was stopped. The disease that spread through the young would not have the chance to contaminate the adults, a necessary sacrifice to ensure the survival of the pride. But the act was not without consequences. The attacks from rivals became more frequent, as if the smell of death and decay attracted them. Other smaller predators prowled the territory, waiting for the exact moment when the T-Rex would let its guard down. And for the adult, it was no longer a matter of protecting itself. It was just a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. Each sacrificed cub was a blow to its own species, a legacy that was destroyed with each death it caused. In the end, the T-Rex was left alone. No cub had resisted the plague. No new generation would rise to dominate the territory it had fought so hard to protect. But it kept moving forward, the instinct for survival pushing it forward even as the world around it fell apart. The decision had been made, the sacrifice completed, but the price to be paid was extinction. The silence of the valley was absolute. Not even the wind dared to cross this territory that had once been teeming with life. Dead trees stood like twisted monuments, their dry branches scraping against the faded sky. The T-Rex advanced through the morbid desert, his muscles tired and his gaze empty. Each heavy step left deep marks in the cracked earth, like permanent scars that no one would ever see. The cubs were gone. each one of them eliminated by the plague or by the very adult that had tried to protect them. A necessary massacre that repeated itself in the T-Rex's mind like an endless echo. He kept moving, hunting, surviving, but it wasn't the same. The world had changed. What had once been his territory was now a colorless graveyard, a maze of dead trees and empty trails. The few herbivores that remained were sick, weak, and scarce. Each hunt was an exhausting effort that was rarely worth it. Hunger was constant. But the real enemy was not lack of food. It was fear. Not fear of rival predators or wounds that would not heal. It was something deeper, something he could not destroy with teeth or claws. Loneliness. No matter how far he advanced, the T-Rex found nothing but death and decay. The trails that had once been walked by others of his kind were abandoned, covered in undergrowth that was slowly taken over. He searched for signs of other T-Rex, any indication that he was not alone, but each time he found broken bones and cracked skulls, the certainty that his clan had become extinct became more evident. The T-Rex's true terror was not hunger. It was not fighting rivals or fighting for territory. It was extinction. The predator that had once dominated the Cretaceous now roamed an empty world, pursued by an enemy he would never fully understand. The plague that had decimated the cubs continued to spread, eating away at what was left of his species from the inside out. And in the end, the question remained simple. Which was more cruel? The disease that was slowly destroying his bloodline, or the instinct that forced him to eliminate his own descendants in an attempt to stop the plague from spreading? The T-Rex stood atop a rocky hill, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. Nothing but barren land and dead vegetation stretched out before him. A kingdom crumbled. For an instant, the wind blew, carrying with it a distant sound, something that could have been a roar. But the T-Rex knew it wasn't real. It was just a ghost, a memory of a world that would never return. He roared, a desperate sound that cut through the air with brutality. But there was no one to hear it. The greatest predator on Earth, reduced to a lonely, dying being, walking through a world that had forgotten its own name. And no matter how strong he was, there was one thing he could never defeat: time.